Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Actual Tech Media Expert Series. My name is Keith Ward. I'm with Actual Tech Media, and I am really excited to be your moderator for this special event on ransomware entry points, trends, and tips. So, before we get to today's content, we do have some housekeeping items you'll need to know to get the most out of this session. First off, we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. You've already been telling us where you're logging in from and listening and watching today, and that's great to see. Keep that coming. Now, at the end of this presentation, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that come in. Now, that Q&A panel is also the place to let us know if we can help you with any technical issues. First thing you always want to do if you have any problems hearing or seeing anything is to do a browser refresh. If that browser refresh doesn't work, let us know in the Q&A and we will get right on it. All right, next up, we have got some handouts that you are definitely going to want to take a look at from our presenters today. And we have got links and we've got PDFs and all kinds of great stuff for you. So make sure you check out that handouts. It's going to be there throughout the entire event. All right, now at the end of the event, we will also be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. And keep in mind that you do have to be in attendance during the live event, during the whole thing, in other words, to qualify for the prize. If you're interested in that kind of dry reading, the official terms and conditions of the drawing can be found in the handout section. All right. Now, these expert series events are special product neutral looks at pressing technology problems presented by an expert in the field. But the support of our sponsors does make it possible for us to bring you this content. So we do want to give a special shout out to them today. So over the next couple of slides, that's what I'm going to do. And remember again, each of these sponsors has got handouts in that section. So let's talk about those. All right here. Handouts section. Got to talk a little bit more about the handouts. Not only are there links and downloadables from the sponsors, we've also got some great Actual Tech Media links. One of those is a link to the Gorilla Guide Book Club, where you can get access to our library of printed resources on a vast array of technology topics. You'll also find a link to the Actual Tech Media Events Center, which has our calendar of upcoming events, probably some that you'll be interested in. I encourage you to look those over and sign up if you see something you like. All right, so let's now talk about our sponsors for a little bit here. Our first sponsor for today is Rubrik. Now, Rubrik pioneered zero trust data security to help protect against cyber attacks like ransomware. So the Rubrik Security Cloud secures data across enterprise, cloud, and software as a service applications. Rubrik does have a handout in the handout section you're going to want to check out as well. Our next sponsor for today's event is ReliaQuest. ReliaQuest acts as a force multiplier for security that increases visibility, decreases complexity, and manages risk, which ultimately reduces the threat of ransomware in your environment. And I think that's something we can all get behind. You see a QR code up there on the screen, so check that out, as well as look over their handout in the handout section. Up next is Rapid7. Rapid7's managed threat complete product uses multiple points of telemetry, open source communities, AI enhanced tools, and other technology to keep your environment safe from ransomware attackers. You can also see a link right there on the slide, and they have a handout as well. Finally, this event is also sponsored by Anaconda, and Anaconda helps secure your software supply chain, which has become a main avenue for ransomware to get into your network. Anaconda blocks risky software via security controls, along with other capabilities to keep you safe You can see a link there. And remember to take advantage of Anaconda's handout in the handout section, and to check out all the other handouts from today's sponsors. And with that, we are going to get to what you've been waiting for, which is the prime content. All right, so we have got a presentation today from Larry Seltzer, an old friend of mine who I've worked with for a long time. Larry is a security researcher. He's an author. He is a CISSP. So those of you in the security industry know what that means. It means he knows his stuff. He's also a software developer, so he has a unique perspective on the issues he's going to be discussing today. At the end of Larry's presentation, I'll also be joining in for some Q&A, so stay tuned for that. Larry is now ready to go, so I am going to turn it over to him.
Okay, thank you, Keith. I'll get going here. I'm Larry Seltzer. I've been in the technology business for about 40 years now, writing software, running product test labs, reviewing products. I've written a lot about technology, particularly security, and recently a lot about ransomware. The subject today is the ways in which ransomware attackers gain entry to your network in order to do damage to your data. Now, one warning, I'm a big fan of basic security principles and practices. And so if you may have heard a lot of what I'm about to tell you already, but just because everyone knows what must be done doesn't mean that it's easy to do. And so here's a quick agenda. I'm going to talk about the landscape of ransomware today a bit. Set the stage. And then I'm going to talk about something I call the ransomware information problem, which I try to keep in mind whenever I examine this, and maybe you should too. I will examine, I'll talk about the different ways that attackers gain entry to your network, and I'll try to make a list that consolidates all the different methods in a useful way. And then I'll enumerate some of the ways you can attempt to prevent these attacks. And I'll close with a discussion of some of the newer developments in the area. So the ransomware problem today, I got to start out by confessing frustration a bit. Ransomware is a problem that emerged decades ago. It's been an endemic threat against large, well-resourced organizations for many, many years. We know how attackers gain entry and commit attacks, yet here we are, it's late 2023, and the problem is in many ways worse than ever. So what's going on here? Who do I blame? There's lots of blame to go around, and the problem comes mostly down to these things just being really complicated. As I said, we generally know what we need to do, but people and organizations don't always have, they don't always do them because nobody's got all the time and budget to do that, and everyone's justifiably afraid of disrupting business. But to give you a sense of, very recently, it picked 3 news stories. A Danish host, Cloud Nordics, a cloud host. They had to tell all their customers that most of them lost all their data following a ransomware attack that was that successfully wiped backups as well as live data. The company explained, and this is via Google Translate, we cannot and do not want to meet the financial demands of the criminal hackers for ransom, at the end of the quote. And they're doing what they can to help customers recover. I don't know this company at all, but it's easy to see it leading to ruin for them and even for many of their customers. Second, and I'm sure most of you know the name Seiko, which was recently hit by the infamous Black Cat ransomware gang. This attack is different and certainly less severe than the Cloud Nordic attack, but it's actually not technically ransomware because there's no word of a ransom being demanded, but it's still really bad and it's ransomware-like. Seiko IT detected a breach and a compromise of some data and revealed that much in a press release. Then the Black Cat gang posted an online taunt of Seiko IT and their security abilities and included what they said were samples of the data they obtained. Black Cat says they have, quote, technical schematics and Seiko watch designs, unquote, which means confidential company intellectual property. I don't know how big a deal this is in the watch business, but no one wants that. Finally, Clop is another ransomware gang, and they took advantage of a vulnerability in a widely used third-party tool called MoveIt, which I think I'll talk about a little later. It's a managed file transfer service. In fact, there were actually several MoveIt vulnerabilities revealed in the customers were being attacked through. Back in June, the company's Progress Software, they revealed them. One of them was a dreaded zero-day vulnerability, an attack for which there's no defense other than maybe pulling the network cable. There's been a wave of ransomware attacks and other attacks through MoveIt vulnerabilities. So faced with a variety of approaches to secure your infrastructure, nobody can just throw enough money at the problem to cover every theoretical base. Besides, even that's no guarantee of anything. If you're not a security expert, you need to consult with someone who is and make sure they understand your business well enough to know where your security money is best spent. One more thing I always like to point out is that even when the problem is technology, there's almost always a human failing behind it. Maybe one day the AIs will be able to remove us carbon-based life forms from the important business of security implementation, but for now we're making the decisions and we'll screw up a lot of them. The ransomware information problem. This is basically, what do we really know about the ransomware problem? Of course, a responsible company discloses to customers when they've been attacked, or so it's easy for me to say. But I tend to think a lot of what goes on in this gets hushed up as much as possible. So I always read the numbers from vendors and analysts, and even from governments, with skepticism. It's not like these gangs have to file quarterly reports or compliance statements with the SEC. It follows necessarily that we know, we can't know with any true confidence what the dominant ransomware entry points are, or even the true extent of the ransomware problem. But we can know a lot of things about the ransomware problem. The dark reading article cited here, it cites links to reports, one from a vendor and one from a consulting group, about public disclosures of breached data by ransomware attackers. There are actually public data dump sites for this, and these data dumps are pretty hard proof of real attacks, and they're illustrative of the risks. The Seiko story I mentioned is another example of such a dump, and the Danish cloud host is an example of cases where the company discloses the attack, if only because they couldn't possibly do anything else. And yeah, the dark reading story by the great Rob Lemos includes a graph that I have here on the number of data leaks per month as measured by the NCC group, the consulting group he cited. So this is just an H1 in 2022 and 2023 graph. I've seen the H2 data, and it's still below the 2023 numbers. So this still makes a valid point. Basically, since March 2023, we've been well over every number in 2022, and it's still trending up. And these are clearly a floor number because clearly there are attacks and even data dumps that aren't being counted here. And not every ransomware attack is a data dump attack too. So, and while we get lots of anecdotal data about the ransomware problem, this graph is a rare example of aggregate data that's generally missing from the record. So now let's move on to the big question. How do ransomware attackers gain a toehold in your network? The point from which they can acquire information and privileges they can then use to encrypt your data, maybe even encrypt your backups or destroy them or copy and dump your confidential data. So I read a lot of reports and other research on ransomware, looking for good information on what the main entry points are, and I threw them into a list and removed the duplicates and came up with this. It's so long as to be discouraging or even useless, and even if it's true that there have been ransomware attacks for which each line item was an entry point. So I created a shorter list. It's comprised of the items that showed up most commonly in other research. Some of these are also consolidations of other bullets from the previous list. For instance, exploitation of patched and unpatched vulnerabilities, which in some ways are very different problems. I'm also throwing malware and compromised credentials into a broader social engineering and phishing category, because that's generally the goal of social engineering and phishing, meaning to compromise credentials or to get a real user to install malware. Even the shorter list could be consolidated some, and I'll go into each of these in detail below. Now, I left out some actual genuine threats from the big list: DDoS, IoT, malicious insiders. There's a few others. Mainly, they don't show up in as often as the ones I did include. And DDoS is really a different kind of attack that could be used for blackmail, meaning I'll make your site inaccessible until you pay up. But there are ways to mitigate that problem, and I don't think it's really a major part. It's not as big a problem as it used to be. So the first big category, software vulnerabilities, and they're nothing new. Very little of any of this is really new. And we know how to deal with them by now, don't we? Yes, but the good news is, at least as I see it, that a variety of long-term developments have made it easier for you, especially end users, to defend yourself against exploits of vulnerabilities in the software you run on your devices. The biggest reason for this was a long time ago, a decision made by Bill Gates in, I think, 2002, that Microsoft really ought to be trying to make their software as secure as possible. Vulnerability problems at Microsoft used to be a problem well out of proportion, even to their dominance in the industry, because there were so many computers out there running it, and so many of them were running old, vulnerable versions that users wouldn't update. This is still true, of course, but it's much, much less true than it used to be. The biggest reason it's not true anymore is that it's become acceptable for vendors in most cases to automate the delivery and installation of updates, especially security updates, and even to reboot the system if necessary. When Microsoft began doing this, a lot of people screamed bloody murder. Time and steady quality improvements have gotten, and the systems have gotten us past that. Of course, it's a more complicated matter with servers on which multiple users rely. You can't just reboot the DNS server and potentially have all your systems offline for a bit, but there are excellent mature products and practices to perform updates, even on critical systems, in a timely manner. Experts all agree that failure to apply security updates in a timely manner is one of the main ways that attackers gain entry to networks. Now, at the same time, Microsoft, at least as a major security vendor of software development tools, they became involved in creating and implementing secure software development practices. The recent incorporation of AI into their development tools, I think it really ought to help this even more. And of course, there's a lot more than Microsoft out there. They became the symbol of insecure software and climbed their way out of that hole. Less obvious was the fact that all the other major software companies were also climbing out of the hole at the same time. And all these companies cooperate extensively on this sort of thing now, and it's really helped in a lot of ways. The vulnerability problem is mostly a problem of people who don't apply the updates. I also think that the widespread move to web and cloud-based software was a good overall for security, and even today it's a good way to make client software more secure, because a smaller set of the software that you're running is running on the client. That's what we call the attack surface. Browsers and websites, of course, have their own security problems and updates, but it still amounts to a major improvement overall. And even so, exploits of vulnerabilities, internet-facing applications are still one of the causes that show up on everyone's list of common ways for ransomware attackers to gain entry. I'm incredulous whenever I read it, but apparently RDP connections are still a common thing, and open RDP connections, and a common entry point for attackers, ransomware attackers included. So RDP, if you don't know, is a terminal protocol that's been in Windows since, I think, NT4 Service Pack 1, maybe 25 years ago. I wrote a book on Windows Terminal Services, the name of the service which implemented RDP in Windows 2000, which was the very next version. And by the time I wrote it, it was already obvious that you wanted to be very careful about how accessible you made the service. Especially, essentially you give a login opportunity to the on the network to anyone who can connect to that IP address. It's usually on a standard TCP port. And still the standard one, and the one that attackers look for. And if it's there, it's as if you let them into the building, gave them a workstation to use. It doesn't give them login credentials, but there are often ways to guess those or buy them. And it's possible, if an incredibly bad idea, to set up your own personal computer with an open RDP connection. And so the first most obvious thing to change is the port number. And everyone's knowing, I think I even wrote that in my book, to something large and random, so it's hard to guess. But RDP really shouldn't be accessible directly from the outside anyway. Organizations that put any thought into this switch to managed solutions from Citrix and VMware that perform the same functions, but do so with much better security. And today we call this virtual desktop. The term misconfiguration is a relatively recent one in terms of security. It refers to a product or service that you might reasonably want to implement, but you configure it in a way that is not as secure as it could be. I skip misconfigurations until after RDP because I want to use it as an example in the sense that you might reasonably want to have RDP on a system, but if you leave it open to the internet, on a standard port, you've configured it so that it's a welcome mat and an open door for attackers. But here I've listed a few other common misconfigurations. It's less common to find default accounts and passwords on these products these days, but there's still a lot of old systems, even routers and other network gear, with default credentials still active. Files and directories unprotected is kind of self-explanatory. Directory traversal is a form of a lack of protection of directories. It's if you let somebody use the ... in a directory, this is maybe kind of a lost bit of detail. But if you do ... it's the parent directory. And and it would be a problem if you let people go up and then start surfing around your file system. There's actually a common software vulnerability being reported. And the last example about URLs is really just another example of this. Default features. You should never enable a feature unless you're actually going to use it. And it's best practice now when you're setting up a product only to enable the features that you actually use. And they're, and many of them like make sure you're making conscious decisions now. And now the feature event, the one you've been waiting for, social engineering. The headline social engineering technique is phishing, especially spear phishing. The overwhelmingly dominant form of this is the email that's disguised as coming from a trusted party. I've also put down other trickery, which is a catch-all for non-phishing behaviors, the point of which is to gain access. The other two items, malware and compromised credentials, are not methods of social engineering, but usually the point of it. The attacker is trying either to capture your credentials or trick you into installing malware. The way you defend against malware and compromised credentials are mostly using some of the techniques that I've already discussed and others I'll get to very soon. In terms of email, a lot of work was done years ago to allow email systems to determine the true sender of a message and alert the user to that fact. These systems, they don't always work, but they usually do. But you have to be minimally attentive to the cues in the email program. If you're not very careful, you might miss that the name isn't exactly what it's supposed to be, what you expect it to be. And if an attacker can't effectively send an email from your CEO, John Smith, as john.smith@yourcompany.com, they may still be able to get johnsmith38@gmail.com and claim to be the CEO on his personal account. Once when I was a contributor to PC Week, which is now eWeek, someone tried to identity theft me by buying a domain name similar to my own and emailing my editor to say that I needed my account reset and please use this email address, and he almost got away with it. So here we're talking about vulnerable human beings again, and that's not a patchable feature on us. At a couple of employers, I've received training in phish spotting that they give to all employees, and they also send out test messages. So, every now and then there are services you can buy, so that every now and then employees have to go through this, this learning, like how to recognize trick messages. And there's really no better way than than this, and I think there's a lot of value in it. I've also received phishing messages on LinkedIn purporting to be from my CEO by attackers who they scan the LinkedIn looking for companies and their employees, and then they target employees in that company. There's no way to solve this problem globally because we're talking about human beings. Trickery can really be just about anything. And once I received what was effectively a phish by US mail. So it's, you just always have to be on alert. So you have to run software, even at the edge, even facing the internet. How do you protect yourself against vulnerabilities in it, other than by applying patches? So the protection options here were a bit thinner than I expected, and maybe I missed something or classified some possibilities elsewhere. But if you're looking for ways to scan in, what you're looking for is ways to scan the input into the network, files, and direct interaction with applications like web form for malicious behavior. And this is what IPS and web application firewalls do. So an antivirus, it's boring old tech, but it's still a basic defense that protects against a lot of very common attacks. These apply to systems like email. All these things apply to systems like email and IM, which end users might interact with and which might be used to attack those end users or the web or application server itself. MultiFactor authentication. One of the biggest things you can do to prevent ransomware attacks and other attacks, and you probably aren't doing it as much as you could, is to roll out strong multi-factor authentication, which usually just means two-factor authentication to all accounts. And everyone in the business agrees that compromised accounts are a major avenue of attack for ransomware, and if done correctly, two-factor authentication almost eliminates them. Certainly it eliminates the easy ways to compromise credentials. The best way is to use physical access tokens, these little key type things that connect to the endpoint you're working on using USB or maybe Bluetooth or NFC. These things actually have a cryptographic processor and a private key in them. And what they effectively do is they strongly prove that the user logging in is the person who should be in possession of the key. And if that's actually you, then it proves that you're really you very strongly, much more than a password would. There are weaker forms of two-factor authentication, like the code that gets texted to your cell phone is a form of two-factor authentication. And there are authenticator apps that do some cryptography that are similar. And these aren't as strong as the keys because there are ways for attackers to get around them using what's called a man-in-the-middle technique. But it's a very hard attack to do, but it can be done. So it's probably only going to be done on a high-value target. The physical tokens conform to a standard called FIDO, and there's a new soft version of FIDO called passkeys, which don't require a physical device, but which are still very strong protection. As of now, only Google really implements them, but a lot of other companies have endorsed them and are supposedly about to release support for them. And so you can expect, you probably can't really use them right now, but you can expect a lot of news about them soon. So, oops, did I skip multi-factor? Did I not have the right screen on? I'm so sorry. This was the multi-factor authentication screen. One last buzzword, zero trust. It's the idea that no user or process should be allowed to access a resource without first proving that they are who they purport to be and that they have sufficient privileges to access the resource. Now, zero trust is a principle. It's not a product. And it's long been part of many products. And in the old days, it was called the principle of least privilege, still used. It's a very old security rule. We're getting more products and services that implement zero trust as a mission. And these generally constitute improvements in the security posture of any organization. You might have heard of SASE, Secure Access Service Edge. It's an outside provider that controls access for any user to any resource from your company, from your data center to cloud services like Salesforce. The big ones are run by companies that have considerable security expertise and are more on top of the current threat landscape than you will ever be, and that provides you with a great deal of protection. IAM, or Identity Access Management, refers to it's a coherent system for controlling identity access and across an enterprise. Now, something like this really is necessary in order to implement zero trust in a truly meaningful way, but it's very complicated, and IAM initiatives typically take years. Not everybody has it completely implemented, but the more you can do, the better. PAM, or Privileged Access Management, refers to a specialized system for controlling particularly powerful accounts, generally administrator and root accounts for critical resources. These are accounts that need protection more than is typical. So in the context of ransomware, for instance, you might want to consider using PAM to control access to your backup administration, making it harder to compromise the backups. Okay, I said I was a big fan of best practices. One of the best lists of best practices is the OWASP Top 10, which you can find here. It's a list that's evolved over the years. This is the top 10 list of types of vulnerabilities. They found this doing a massive survey and test of applications. So the order corresponds to the frequency with which the vulnerabilities appeared in the test. So more applications had broken access control than any other type. Now, arguably, this list downplays severity in favor of prevalence, but they're both really important. And I don't have time to go into detail on all of this, but they're all examples of general principles you would want to follow in system design. Broken access control is one thing that zero trust can help prevent. OWASP collects a group of different vulnerabilities into this bucket. General ones such as not checking for proper privileges when granting access to a resource, and more specific ones like forcing a browser to authenticate pages as an unauthenticated user, or to access privileged pages as a standard user. A lot of security tools are built around scanning for these particular vulnerabilities, and they can also definitely help you out. So another buzzword you've heard recently, I'm sure, is the software supply chain. This refers to the fact that when you write an application today, most of the actual code, as much as 90%, I've seen, is actually composed of third-party libraries, generally open source libraries that everyone relies on. The repositories that we get these programs from have a lot of malicious code masquerading as legit code, and they use techniques called like typo squatting. A simple example of this would be if you had a library called mobile widgets, they might put a 0 where the O is. So somebody might mistakenly pick that one, thinking it's the one they're really looking for. A couple of major incidents in recent years raised this topic's profile. The SolarWinds attack, most famously a few years ago, where sophisticated Russian hackers compromised the networks of SolarWinds, which is a security software company whose products were used by major corporations and governments all over the world. The attackers were able to insert malware into a production level SolarWinds product. A better example, I think, is Log4j. This is an open source program that was widely used for logging events in other programs. So if you're writing an application, you're a developer and you need something to log events in it, you just pull in the open source Log4j program. And there were, I believe it was the end of 2021 or the beginning of 2022, there were a bunch of severe vulnerabilities announced in it, and they released patches for them too. But it quickly became evident that a lot of people have Log4j installed as part of applications that they installed and had no idea they were running Log4j. If the developers, if the developers on top of things, they might issue an update, but what if they're not? And what if you're not paying them for ongoing support? Why should they provide an update? So to address this problem, there's a series of new competing standards for what's called software bills of material, or SBOM. Think of this as like a bill of lading for software that you receive. It includes everything about all the input components into that software, including the versions, when it was built and by whom. It can include information on the licenses of those components, because some people don't want certain open source licenses on their networks. And all this is digitally signed, so it can't be modified, at least not easily. If you had SBOMs for all your software and a vulnerability is announced somewhere, and your security systems can access that intelligence of the vulnerability, look at all of your SBOMs and tell you whether you had a vulnerable component and exactly where it's installed. And this is something that is actually really helpful and has just not been available before. It's another thing that you might have to buy or keep track of anyway. But I really like the potential for SBOM. And also the federal government a couple of years ago mandated that all software built for them and for companies that do business with them will have to have SBOMs. So everyone's going to have to do it soon. And you're going to hear a lot about this, and it really has the potential to automate a lot of security process that's badly neglected today. Speaking of automation, there's been an emphasis in the industry in recent years on automation, and it's a really good thing. A lot of security doesn't get done because it's a pain and it's perceived as getting in the way of real work. To the extent that security can be automated into a process, it's much more likely to get done correctly. When a new user is created, they should automatically have to create a strong password or even better, enroll a two-factor device. And they should be assigned to particular roles in an IAM. When an application is deployed, its privileges should be minimal and expanded only by deliberate decision. The most important automation often happens in software development and deployment. So you may have heard the term DevOps, which is the idea of combining the development of software with testing and deployment into operations. And all this is in an automated cycle, which each stage gives feedback into the others. DevSecOps adds security processes to this. And this is something that developers really love. There's a lot of overlap between this and software supply chain issues because it's in the development process that the components are assembled and the SBOM is created. There's a relatively new class of security products, mostly designed for DevSecOps, that automatically examine the SBOMs of input components, scan them with various techniques, and check them against security intelligence and vulnerability databases, to try to keep vulnerable components out. And then they themselves compose an SBOM for you, for the developer to deliver to you. Variations on these techniques are still useful for enterprises that are just deploying applications, looking at the SBOMs rather than building them. Another new development, which I've seen from some of the same companies is curated open source libraries, which are, so you don't go to the big public one that has all the crap in it. Everything in it has been pre-cleared for security purposes. And lastly, there's an interesting report there from IBM on the cost of data breaches that spend a lot of time praising the benefits of DevSecOps for its ability to prevent breaches and lower costs of them. And that's all I have time for, and it may actually be more than I have time for. So first, I'll thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them as best I can. So, Keith?
Yeah, thank you, Larry. Great presentation. It's really nice to have you catch us up on the world of cybersecurity and what's going on in the trends. Some really eye-opening stuff for me, especially the S bomb. I really wasn't that aware that that was becoming a big thing. So really valuable stuff. And you're right, we do have some great questions coming in from the audience. So let's get into some of them. So here's a really good one to start off with. One thing you didn't talk about today was cybersecurity insurance or cyber insurance. Does this mean that it's not really necessary, or what is sort of your current thought, the current industry thought on the necessity of cyber insurance?
Um, I like the answer is you have to shop around. Wherever you get business insurance probably has some relationships for these policies. I've read that for large companies, premiums are in the tens of thousands of dollars a year. Obviously, the policy won't prevent an attack, and if you're attacked, you can't assume that you'll actually get as much money as the policy is set for, or that the money will come in time for you to use it for immediate recovery. Also, I think it was last year, companies started to narrow the scope of policies. The famous example of this was when Lloyd's of London, which is the reinsurer for a lot of the insurance companies you're dealing with, they said that they would no longer write policies that covered state-sponsored attacks. I don't know how they're supposed to know, or you're supposed to know,
Right.
that the attack that you suffered is state-sponsored, but it's a handy excuse for them to have. So I guess if you can't tell, I'm a little leery of the whole thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Not only that, I mean, once you're with all the requirements that these insurance companies make you meet, you're going to be pretty darn secure at that point
Mm-hmm.
anyway. So, yeah, absolutely. Here's another really good one, and this goes back to something you had talked about earlier, related to the multi-factor authentication and how onerous things can be for employees. So somebody asked, my company makes me change my password every 3 months, and the password has to be one of these things that's hard to remember, lots of special characters, et cetera, et cetera. uh, in the days of multi-factor authentication, is this really necessary?
Well, the short answer is no. And maybe the long answer is no also. Just in terms of changing passwords every 3 months, it's at least 5 years since um, you know the real authorities in this decided that that's really of no use and that it causes more problems than it solves. Um, if you're going to rely on passwords, then password length and complexity are important, and maybe you can mitigate some of that by allowing passphrases, which is like a group of words um, that may be easier to remember. Like I saw this as Spinal Tap 25 times. That's I don't know if anybody's going to guess. Any like you know hacker is going to guess that, but if you have like a strong FIDO protection, you don't even really need a password at all. The password is sort of and when you do a passkey, I think I mentioned Google does it. When you set up a passkey with Google, um, basically your password goes away. You don't really need your password anymore. Um, and that's because passwords are awful. They just they just don't work very well, and security people have been trying to get rid of them for a long time. And the current best hope of mankind is passkeys. We'll see.
So, kind of related to that, then, you mentioned a lot of mitigation techniques in your presentation. um, but not all mitigation techniques are created equal. So, What are some of the, if you had to narrow it down, what is the single most important thing you can do to upgrade your cybersecurity? Like, let's narrow it down to one single thing that you could tell a company, here's what you need to do that'll have the greatest effect. What would that thing be?
Oh, that's easy. That is two-factor authentication. Because we know if you do it really well, that those compromised credential attacks are almost certainly, they're prevented. Um, all but the most sophisticated, like NSA or IMF, the Possible Mission Force. There's not a very few agencies are going to be able to get past them. You also might want to urge employees to use two-factor authentication on their personal accounts because, like I said, they can be used for phishing the company. And you might even offer to help them set those up. I don't know if I've ever heard of anyone doing that, but now that I say it out loud, it sounds like a good idea to me. People really don't like the physical keys, even though they're considered, the best, the state of the art, for a bunch of reasons. Passkeys, of course, if they work, they're going to be, they might be the answer. I've set one up on my own Google account, like I said, and you can too. Just Google passkeys, and it'll tell you how. I have to say, it wasn't especially easy.
Wait, you've got it set up, but do you use it?
Well, by default, I use it.
Yeah.
What happens is once you have it set up, then you go to Google. If you try to, instead of logging in with your password, it'll check to see, it'll challenge your system if there's a passkey, and then basically your system looks at the passkey is itself a private key, and the computer then does the public key cryptography to respond to the server, and that's an automatic authentication. And there's no passwords, and basically as long as you physically have the device, then you're protected. The theory that passkeys can get around the physical, the second factor of the physical device is that the what you're using is the second factor. If you have a phone, then it has, in fact, you have to have a biometric enabled for passkeys to be installed. You have to either have facial or fingerprint authentication. And like it works on my laptop because I've got fingerprint, and it works on my my desktop because I have a very quality camera. If you have it's not going to work on everything because they do require that you have a biometric, but that's going to be, it's not going to require you to do anything once it's set up. Setting it up is a little complicated, and getting people to understand what a passkey is actually, a little troublesome too. I'm really hoping it works, but at the moment I'm leery.
And it's not foolproof either, but it certainly gets you a lot closer,
Mm-hmm.
to great security. Okay, Larry, I think we have time for one more question today, and this is we saved the most controversial one, I think, for last here. Um, what is your current thought on the trend in whether companies should pay ransoms or not? This is something that's been discussed for a long time, but I'm kind of wondering from a trends perspective, are we seeing more companies, more governments, et cetera, are they refusing to pay ransoms more and more, or is it pretty much business as usual?
Well, this is one of those knowledge problem things. I don't know if anybody's, if they're paying and not telling, and or not. I mean, you find out, like I said, like the Danish cloud company, they wouldn't pay, and they had to fess up to it, so you know about that. And they said that they would, and they couldn't pay. They might have considered negotiating. Apparently, you can negotiate with some of these people. I mean, why shouldn't they accept? Say, look, I can give you this much. Otherwise, you get nothing. It's worth it for the attacker to negotiate. But if if failing to recover from the attack is a death sentence for your company, and you can pay the ransom without breaking the bank, then yeah, it might actually be the right thing to do under the circumstances. So you just got to understand that paying the ransom isn't a guarantee that you're going to get your data back. They could, the decryption process could fail, or they could just not give you a key to decrypt with and go away. They stiff you, and you'd have no recourse. So The best thing is what we've been talking about here today is just to try not to be the victim, because once you're the victim, like there's not going to be a good outcome. That never
Point.
happens.
It's better not to have to be in that.
Yep.
In that at that decision point, isn't it?
Mhm.
Always not to have to wonder if you should pay it or not. Well, Larry Seltzer, as always, this has been a real delight to talk to you, to learn from you, and I thank you so much for your time and insights and your presentation today, and for the great answers in the Q&A. Have a really enjoyed having you on.
Okay, thank you. Good to be here.
Thanks, Larry. All right. I told you Larry was good. He is always fun to talk to. He is so knowledgeable and brings some real world experience to all of this. So great to be on with Larry and going through some of your fantastic questions. As always, love to see the interaction today from everyone. Looks like you folks are really engaged, which is exactly what we want. So that concludes the presentation. It is now time for the Amazon gift card prize drawing. As I mentioned at the beginning, you do have to be present for the entire event to be eligible for any of our prize drawings. And we do have one for today. The winner of this $250 Amazon gift card is Mark Bukta from Missouri. Congratulations, Mark. We will be in touch with you very soon to get you your card. And everyone, that is a wrap for me today. On behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank our sponsors for making this event possible. Again, that's Rubrik, ReliaQuest, Rapid7, Anaconda. You got a few more seconds to download some handouts if you still want to do that before we are totally out of here, but only a few seconds, so jump on it right now. Thank you as always for attending. Thank you for spending a little bit of your time with us today. I hope you learned a lot about ransomware. I think there was a lot of information that news you can use, right? That's what the New York Times used to call it. News you can use. I think we all got a lot of that today, and we'll be better prepared in the future for what the bad guys are doing. So thanks again for being here with us. I really enjoyed being here with you today. That concludes the event as well. We are done, folks. Have a great rest of your day.